Obviously, the objective of all of us, and as we've read in that passage tonight, is to become like Christ. We're aiming, aren't we, to become people that our Master can look at and say, I can see enough of you in me that I'm willing to give you eternal life. And we know that will only occur by the grace of God. But we do need to, in the meantime, try and shape and mould ourselves into people who reflect Christ. And Philippians 2 is one of those passages, isn't it, that we could turn to that tells us that and helps us to be encouraged in that way. Verse 5, as Brother Jared read for us tonight, let this mind be in you which was in Christ Jesus. That's something which we are all aiming for. And then it goes on to explain for us, doesn't it, that what Christ did was to make himself not equal with God, but as a servant, to humble himself, to become obedient unto death, even the death of the cross in verse 8. And we know then that the result of that was, in verse 9, that wherefore God hath highly exalted him and given him a name which is above every name, that at the name of Jesus every knee should bow, of things in heaven, of things in earth, and things under the earth, and that every tongue should confess that Jesus Christ is Lord, to the glory of the Father. Wherefore, my beloved, as ye have always obeyed, not as in my presence only, but now much more in my absence, work out your own salvation with fear and trembling. And that's the position that we're in, aren't we? We're in this period of time where it's up to us to work out our salvation with fear and trembling. So clearly the mind then is a very important topic for us to consider, and how we exercise that mind, the things that we do with it, is going to be very important to our growth. Now, until the early 1970s, the received wisdom of the scientists at the time was that in early childhood, the brain was extremely malleable. It was changing all the time, things were being added, there was pruning taking place, and it was going through this huge process of change. They then thought that it stopped, and then at a point it was locked in place, and that's the mind that you had to go forward with. It wasn't actually until the 1980s, so relatively recently, that the idea that the brain was continually changing was understood, and that it became widely accepted. And now the understanding is that the brain has the ability to reprogram itself on the fly, altering the way it functions in a number of different situations. And you may have heard of it, but that's called neuroplasticity. And we're going to be talking about some of those concepts tonight. And the fact that it wasn't just in childhood that neuroplasticity was occurring, but it occurs right throughout life, is something which is a very important thing for us, I think, and something that we can take quite a bit of encouragement from. If you haven't read Dr. Norman Doidge's book, The Brain That Changes Itself, I can recommend it. It's well worth a read. And there are some amazing stories in that book about people who have had strokes, and they have, through a lot of rehabilitation and a lot of intensive work, they have been able to reprogram the brain to use, or for the brain to work around the dead part or the part that's been damaged, and to create the functions that it once had and used in those areas in another part of the brain. That's amazing. And so we're going to consider this idea of neuroplasticity in the context of technology and what it does, and obviously what that might mean in us, as our chairman said, in the modern world, trying to serve God. Just to summarise last week, we looked at 5 different areas, if you like, or considerations, things that we could think about in our families particularly and in our ecclesial environments that might help us to think about how we adopt, how we use technology, and what we might do to try and make sure that we don't have a negative impact on ourselves. So what we saw was that the values that we share, what they call culture, when a technology is introduced, there is going to be a price. And so it's up to us as a group of people who share those values to consider that and try and make sure that we have the least amount of impact as possible. Because if we do introduce something, then it's actually quite difficult to reverse the impacts of what that might have been. And it's really important that we, as a group, respect people and the wisdom that comes from age. Second thing was that we need to consider that when the technology comes in, it rarely benefits everybody the same way. So we need to think about what it gives, what it might take away, who might be impacted by that, and ensure that everybody in our ecclesial groups, in our families, is kept together and no one's left behind. We considered that every technology has a particular philosophy or number of philosophies potentially associated with it. It's good for us to understand what they are and try then to make decisions with those in mind. Not all of those will be good, some of them will be. When we introduce a technology, we're not just having what we had before with the new technology, we're changing the mix and the dynamic of the group that we're in. We need to understand that and consider carefully what that might be. Question that before we adopt it. And as with any technology, it blends into the background. As you said, none of us think about turning on a light switch and where the electricity comes from. We get in our cars and drive different places. We don't think about that. Those are all technologies and they've become accepted. And that's what technology will do. It'll work its way into the background of our minds, of our culture, of our families, whatever it might be, and it'll just become part of who we are. That might not necessarily be a good thing. Sometimes we have to hold things at arm's length. Can anyone remember what we had as a definition of technology last week? Yeah, we're changing the world from the way it is to the way that we desire it to be. Well, I'm going to put up another one tonight, and this one sort of brings it a little bit more focused on ourselves. It's an expression of human will, and that comes from a writer called Nicholas Carr. I guess with anything, we can look at things at a high level, so changing the world to the way we desire, but when we start to think about what technology most often is ourselves, it's got to do with us, and it's the way we express ourselves. So we'll keep that in mind for tonight. Okay. As I said, the brain is an incredible organ. It's the organ in the body, I think, that probably scientists understand the least, and it's obviously by far the most complex. Now, I'm definitely not a neuroscientist. I'm not even medically trained, so there are lots of people who would know far more about this than what I do. But one of the things that I've found is that they've, in working out what the brain's doing at any given time, they've worked out that it can be processing up to 2 million input messages at any given moment. That's coming from all over the place through the body, different cells, externally, all sorts of different things. So at any given point in time, our brain can be dealing with up to 2 million messages. And if you think about that in terms of those that are into IT and how much computing power there is, I think it was only recently that they developed a computer processor that was capable of processing as many messages per minute or per second as what the human brain is able to do. And that's not even commercially available at the moment. So it's a long way behind. So the brain is a phenomenal organ, and it's a phenomenal creation that we should try to use well. It creates and stores memories in ways that scientists don't even yet understand. They understand what happens in terms of electrical circuits, but if they tried to explain how a memory is stored, that's not understood. Yet we know, don't we, that the Father can raise somebody from the dead and create them with those memories in place. He knows and understands that. That's a a wonderful thing that we worship the God, the creator of the earth, that is capable of something like that. And my comments tonight are going to be primarily focused on that frontal lobe. That's the area that deals with cognition or thinking. It deals with memory, concentration, judgment, consequences, analysis, problem solving, planning, and it's also where personality is thought to reside. Now, our brains have these things called neurons. And I know we probably didn't come to Bible class necessarily for an anatomy lesson, but bear with me, because the brain is an organ that can conceive an intangible God. And it's the organ with which we choose to praise God or to disappoint him. And it's where the struggle between sin and holiness comes down to a fraction of a second. There's a saying, I'm not too sure again who it's attributed to, but between stimulus and response there's a gap. And in measuring that gap, scientists have determined that it's about 0.4 of a second. So if you've got your hand on a mouse, you've got it hovering over a link, and you're saying, I'm going to click on that, you've got 0.4 of a second to stop yourself, if that's what's needed. So it's pretty important, isn't it, that we understand how this particular organ works and how we can train it to help us in our service to God. Of these neurons, there's something in the order of 100 billion of them in a brain. And they can range in length from a few micromillimeters to up to a metre. And each of them is made up, as you can see on the on your left-hand side, of a body, that's the long bit, and it's got an axon, and it's got dendrites. And the messages are received from one axon, they travel through the body and to the dendrite, and they're transmitted then on and on and on through these synaptic gaps that sit between each of the neurons. Now that's a very simplistic explanation, but it's a complete spaghetti bowl of these connections. They're winding in or out, they're making connections all over the place, all these different circuits that connect and run all of these different functions that we have in our brains. And the cell body, that sort of long bit, the axon there, is often covered with a fatty sheath called myelin. And that myelin sheath helps the electrical impulses to travel down the axon and pass through the different circuits. And when we exercise our minds on a particular function, then we get better at it, and that myelin sheath, if that's the way you say it increases, it fattens up, it thickens up, and it makes that function even more efficient. And there's a saying in neuroscience that neurons that fire together wire together, and that's fairly important, as we'll see. And of course, whenever these circuits are firing, then it releases a dopamine chemical into our brain. That's a pleasure chemical, and it tells our brain, hey, we like this, we want to do this again. And that's what encourages our brain to continue to do these things. So our brains are constantly changing then, as you can imagine, in response to everything that's going on around us. We won't leave here tonight with our brains in the same condition as they were when they got here. We won't have a brain in the same condition tomorrow as it was today or was yesterday. It's continually changing with all of these experiences, and our behaviours and all these circuits are reworking themselves with every input that we have. And it's not just repeated physical actions that can rewire our brains, it's also purely mental activities will alter the neural circuits in our brain with each time that something happens. One of the studies that they did is they had two groups of people, and they had a group of people that were given a tune to play on the piano. So they sat at the piano and they physically played that tune. The other group of people had the same tune, but they had to just sit there and sing it in their heads or think about playing that particular tune, not touching a physical piano at all. The impact on the brain was found to be exactly the same. There was no difference between purely thinking about playing the tune and actually playing the tune itself. So mental activity, physical activity can have the same impact. And as we said, each circuit in the brain is going to strengthen with repetition. And whether that's physical or mental, they transform that activity into a habit. I just want you to remember that. We're going to come back to that idea of habit a little bit later. So when they form these circuits, our brain wants to actually continue to do what they've connected. Once we've wired that circuit in our brain, we want to keep it activated, we want to keep it going. So that's the way the brain then fine-tunes itself and its operations. Routine activities are covered out, are undertaken or carried out even more quickly and efficiently than what they were. If a circuit's unused, then it starts to decay, and eventually, if it's not used for a length of time, the brain will actually can prune the neurons away that use that circuit, and it would have to be then relearned. So tonight, I want to look at this challenge of technology in 4 different impacts to our brain. And so the first one I want to look at tonight, and it's sort of in our title, The Ecology of Technology Distraction. And that was a saying that was put out there by a blogger called Cory Doctorow. And what they're saying is that when we enter into the online world, and when that becomes a part of a place that we're active, then we're immediately bombarded with all these distractions. And so distraction is actually a major impact on us. And as we'll see, distraction is, in my view, others may differ, but it's a really important thing for us to try and hold back from, because it will negatively impact what we need in terms of brain function to worship God. And we'll see that in just a little while. The number of interruptions that we can have during a day from our electronic devices is quite massive. And just some statistics, in one study that was done in the US, that 50% of 6-year-olds and 80% of 12 to 18-year-olds have mobile phones, the vast majority of which are considered smartphones. And the alerts that come out from these devices have the effect of conditioning our brains. A 2013 study in the US said that there was something in the order of 63.5 notifications per day to alert someone that something's happened and to insist that they interact with that. Now on my phone I've got it's a little function, Android function, and it counts the notifications and things that I have. And just the other night I thought I'd flick back through that and sort of see what sort of level of notifications that I receive. Over probably a 3-week period, I was averaging 200 notifications a day. That's ridiculous. I don't know whether I actually look at all of those, but a lot of them would be work emails and things like that, so probably I do see them. But just think, 200 times a day I've got something going off, a vibration or a noise or something to say, hey, I've got a message for you. That's crazy. And we'll talk about that a little bit more and its impact on our working memory when we look at our third impact. I talked a little bit before about dopamine that gets released, and every time something happens that we like, we get this dopamine release, and that reinforces something that is pleasurable, and we want to do that again. And every time we get a post on Facebook or a like or some message from someone, a text or whatever it might be, if it's something that we like, then we're going to get that dopamine hit, and the brain wants to fire that circuit again. So it's always wanting to do that. So we're getting this massive amount of stimuli coming at us left, right and centre wanting us to interact with it, wanting us to notice it, wanting us to be pleased by it, and then do it all over again. The other thing that I found interesting was a study that was done on movies, because you think about a 2-hour or 90 minutes feature-length movie. You're sitting there, you're watching that, and there's action happening all the time. Most of the time, probably a documentary might be different, but there's all this change that's going on. And so you're getting fired with all these things that your brain needs to react to. And one of the things I had a look at over a 100-year period from the early 1900s to the early 2000s was the changes in the style of movie, and in particular the shot lengths. And this is what they found. So you see that graph there, and in the early 1900s, then the average shot length of a particular scene or something that you're watching in a movie was quite a bit longer than what it is now. So I think you look at that trend line going down, the figures would be something in the order of from 12 seconds to 2.5 seconds. So every 2.5 seconds in modern movies, and you can put video games in the same category as this because the same method is being used in creating them, is that every 2.5 seconds on average, something's changing and the brain's reacting to that and changing that, and it has to react to something and think about what it's doing. So massive amounts of stimulus which is being thrown at us in video content, gaming content. Another area to think about in this whole idea of distraction is what that does, as we're talking about the circuits that were being fired all the time, creates a habit, or in some cases an addiction. And there's a video game designer in 2010 by the name of Tute Wiedemann, and he said that the whole idea of the gaming industry was to monetize the weakness of people. We want to bring them in, keep them addicted, and make them keep on playing. So they want to fire these circuits, they want the reward chemicals to kick in, they want people to come back. And the more we do that, obviously, the more they want to, the more they're going to try and throw at us. Now, I don't know if many of you know much about gaming, but I think the hot game at the moment is a game called Fortnite. Some young people at the back get that. Maybe some of the older ones don't. It's essentially a game where there's a couple of different modes, but 100 people get parachuted onto an island. The idea is that you kill everyone else and be the last one standing. You do a bunch of things along the way, but it's. I think they set a record for 250 million players playing simultaneously at one time not long ago. So super important in some people's lives. And I talked about last week about the different ages of the online community, and we're sort of getting into the algorithms that are starting to throw things up here. Well, what landed in my feed I think it was on Wednesday or Thursday. Fortnite addiction is harming a new wave of Australian kids, sparking aggression and absenteeism. So this article, and I won't go through a lot of it, but it's really saying that there's a real problem, and Fortnite's not the only game, so this is not having a go at Fortnite. A lot of the games will be similar to this. There'll be another one in 6 months' time and Fortnite will be forgotten. But Australian children as young as 7 years old are launching aggressive attacks on their parents, lying to get out of school and avoiding family holidays to play Fortnite marathons as the video game phenomenon recruits a new generation of underage players. In one extreme example, a teenage boy threatened to set fire to his room unless his parents gave him his computer back, and then he carved his name in the wall of the family home because he was upset. And education and neuroscience experts are now understanding more and more that excessive use of these types of games and excessive distraction that comes from immersing ourselves in the online world is something which is starting to bring about these sorts of behaviours. And one of the other things that they're starting to find more and more, and this is sort of happening over 10 or so years now, but the rate or the speed at which a clinical diagnosis of addiction is being reached is really low. And this is not a gaming example, but a Pentecostal pastor that I was talking to some years ago who was part of a prison ministry. They did some research into addiction. That was particularly pornography addiction. But addiction, a clinical diagnosis of addiction took 4.5 hours. 4.5 hours. The constant stream of content which was available and the speed at which that could be consumed, 4.5 hours was all it took to create an addiction. It's chemical circuits firing, dopamine. The brain probably bathed in dopamine, and it created that habit, that addiction, that quickly. And that's the sort of thing they're starting to find with a lot, not just gaming, but online addiction in general. And the World Health Organization is just now starting to recognise that. Of course, the gaming industry, well, it's got a different view. And those of you who were around with the tobacco wars back in the sort of 40s and 50s, 60s perhaps, will recognise some of the attitudes which are represented here. So the gaming industry, representing major publishers, they actually met with the World Health Organization to try and postpone any official recognition of a gaming disorder. We believe that continued conversation and educational research is needed before any classification is finalised. Another one, the International Game Developers Association also called the classification troubling and prejudicial against gaming as a hobby and interest. It's not really that bad. It's a few edge cases. It's not really an issue. Exactly the same response that the cigarette and tobacco industry had around the health impacts of cigarettes. Just another anecdote. Some of you will know Brother Steve Dangerfield. He and his wife were up in Queensland having dinner one night with a work colleague of Brother Steve's. Her husband was a test pilot, a helicopter test pilot in the army. And during the conversation, Sister Annie said to him, when you send these people out to war, how do you know they're going to react in the way that you want them to? His response was, our simulators, largely big, sophisticated computer games, he said they are so real, we are 90% plus confident that in a battle situation, they'll react the way that they've been trained. That's what the impact can be from these sorts of activities when they're immersed in them. Now, they've got a good reason to do that, not that we would necessarily agree with it, but that's the impact that it can have on the mind, that it can create a habit, it can create an instinct so powerful that they'll react the way that they've been trained to in some of the worst situations that are imaginable. The brain is really powerful. What we do to it can have a lasting and massive impact on it, and we shouldn't just think that it's a benign thing that we're doing when we're mucking around with technology. It can have a serious impact, and we need to treat it seriously. Okay, I'm keeping an eye on the time. We did pretty well with time last week. I better move on. The next area that I want to look at is the area of, it's the difference between two major modes that our brain has. One's called power browsing and the other's deep thinking. And you can probably understand those. If you read a newspaper, you're walking down the street, you're power browsing, you're looking around, you're taking in different stimuli, you're deciding what to do, you're moving on. That power browsing, we do it all the time. It's a natural way that our brain works, and it's important. We need that. And the other is deep thinking, which obviously is that stopping, thinking, analysing, ruminating on something, critical thinking, problem solving, they require power browsing. Power browsing doesn't include creating long-term memories. That's not what it's for. The information that we power browse is used, discarded. And an interesting study that I read recently, it was a 2011 study from Germany. They've calculated that the brain forgets information at the rate of 1 bit per second per active neuron. If you want to extrapolate that out, there's 8 bits to a character, number of seconds in a day, so on and so forth. I calculated out that your brain, or one neuron, can forget 3 pages worth of information per day. It's just gone. Now, the volume of data coming in, data going out, doesn't really matter. We're still retaining information. But that's what our brain's doing. Use, don't need it, don't need it. And that's what the power browsing mode is doing. It's not trying to form a long-term memory or a long-term activity. It's just using and sending it out. And power browsing is the dominant ethic. We talked about the embedded philosophy last week. Power browsing is the dominant philosophy of the online world. On the flip side to that, you've got a cognitive neuroscientist at Yale by the name of Ken Pugh. He said, think about reading a book, because reading a book and taking the time to ruminate is more cognitively enriching than the short little bits that you might get in your 30-second digital mode. Another study that they did, they put up a page of text starting with no hypertext links and increasing the volume of hypertext links in that content up to a certain level, and they had people reading them. Now, when you're reading a document on the web and you see these hypertext links, whether you think it or not, your brain is stopping at that hypertext link saying, should I click on it? Every time it does that, it's got that little bit of extra load that it's going through, and it's taking away from you actually absorbing the content and thinking about it. And there was a stark contrast between the amount of the text that was remembered from obviously no hypertext links through to lots of hypertext links. Are there any people here at university? Yeah. Do you read lots of scholarly papers? Do they have Harvard referencing? I hate Harvard referencing. Because every time it comes along and it's got this little bracket with a name and a date or something in it, my brain says, oh, okay, I should understand that, shouldn't I? And I've lost the sense of that paper. Every little distraction that is in there is making it harder for us to understand what someone said. Now, another study that they did, and when the reading was on tonight, I was actually looking around a bit to see what people were doing. Standard in Christadelphia, isn't it, that we follow along with the reading? We've been taught year after year that if someone's reading, you follow it along. Well, they actually did a study between listening to somebody else reading it for yourself with no distraction, and following along and reading while someone else was reading and trying to understand it. Want to have a guess which one was worst? Sorry? While someone was reading. Yeah, because there's that distraction. Your brain's partly listening, partly looking at the words, trying to make a decision. Now, I'm not saying we need to change the way we do our readings or what we teach people. I don't want to be a heretic, but I'm just saying that our brains work better in different modes. Maybe we should think about it. And I know I do the same when doing the readings with the kids at home. Joel, you're not following. Emily, concentrate. Well, in actual fact, they might actually be getting more out of it listening to someone else read than me forcing them to read along. Anyway. So, the point I'm trying to get here is these two different modes of thinking, and one of them's really important for us, and the other one we need, but if we use it too much, then it's going to start to create problems for us. When we go online, as we said, we're entering an environment that promotes the power browsing mode, and that's what it wants us to do. We've got powerful tools for finding information, for expressing ourselves, for conversing with others, but it also turns us into somewhat of a lab rat. and then we're pressing the little button to get the next reward. It grabs our attention, but then it also scatters that attention as we follow every little rabbit hole that it offers to us. If you want to try and understand what the ethic of the internet is from a cognitive perspective, they say try reading a book while doing a crossword puzzle. Trying to do two cognitive activities at the same time, it's just not going to happen. And again, we sort of talked last week about philosophies. The point that we can make out of this too is that we might consider ourselves to be smarter, and in some ways we are demonstrably smarter than what we were maybe 30 years ago. But that's if we measure ourselves or intelligence by the net standards, by online standards. If we take that as a standard, yeah, we're smarter. If it's not the standard, then in actual fact, we're not nearly as intelligent as what we might think we are. So as we bring that back to ourselves, though, I want to make this point. We, as a community, are trying to connect with an intangible God. We're trying to make him real in our lives. We're trying to understand his wonderful purpose, we're trying to understand his character, and we're trying to put that to practice in our lives. And if we end up spending most of our time in a power browsing mode, then they've demonstrated that our deep thinking will start to fail. Apparently the mapped brain spaces for power browsing and deep thinking are next to each other in the brain. And as one area becomes strengthened, it says, I need more space. And it'll start to move into an area that's not being used. And so over time, if we were to continue down that path, then our capacity for deep thinking itself will actually weaken to the point that it might not actually be useful enough to do what we need to do, and that is to connect with God, to lay out the scriptures, to analyse it, to understand it, to link it. They're really intense ways of thinking. And if we don't use it, we are going to lose it. And I don't know whether I'm overcalling it, but I actually have a fear that in our community worldwide, that if Christ doesn't return, if we don't take steps, we could end up with a generation of people who are actually physically incapable of understanding and connecting with God. And I think that's something that we need to think about, not just as ecclesias, but as families and our community and the brotherhood more widely. The next concept, and any parent will understand this, is the concept of boredom. I don't know how many times you might get your kids saying to you, I'm bored. Well, I can say that my kids never tell me they're bored, or at least they don't anymore. They've learned their lesson. Because boredom is actually good for the brain. If you haven't got something going on, then your brain is actually running processes, clearing things up, processing memory, consolidating things. So when my kids used to tell me they were bored, then they'd all of a sudden realise, we're going to set Dad off and we're going to hear about the cognitive benefits of boredom. And I've actually heard them in the next room saying, no, we can't say we're bored because Dad will tell us to sit down and just think about things. I don't know if that's a good thing or not, but suffice it to say, our brains actually need downtime. We actually need a time that we don't have this bombardment, this cacophony of noise coming at us so that we can process things. And that's not new to any of us really, but it's something that's probably becoming more important to us as time goes on. Oh, I'm going really badly with time. I want to throw this one in here. If you don't know, these two people, Abraham Lincoln, Stephen Douglas, they obviously lived in the mid-1800s, and they had some absolutely phenomenal debates in the mid-1950s leading up to the 1960 election, which Abraham Lincoln won. Now, the reason that I want to talk about this is that these debates that they had were legendary, and one of them they had in 1854 started off with a 3-hour address from Douglas, followed by a 3-hour response from Lincoln, followed by a 1-hour rebuttal by Douglas. Now, if you've added that up, that's 7 hours of listening to someone speak. How would we go with that? I know I probably wouldn't do very well. 3 hours, 4 hours, 1 hour, sometimes that's hard enough. 7 hours that they listened to people, and the first discussion finished at 5 o'clock. Lincoln got up and said, look, I'm going to be talking for another 3 hours, and then there's another hour to come. There's another 4 hours of talking. How about you go home, have some tea, and then come back and we'll continue? And they did. These debates were packed out. And it wasn't the intellectual elite that were going to listening to these. This was general people. This is how people got their information about political discourse in those days. It was normal for them. And the concepts that Douglas and Lincoln were putting out and the way they structured their sentences were not simple. It wasn't dumbed down to 3-word slogans and a 30-second soundbite. These were complex discussions that were going on. And the people were engaged in that. They understood it. That was the intellectual ethic of that time. It was normal. Now, the reason that I bring that up is, and you probably picked the time, mid-1800s, that's the writings, the time that a lot of the pioneer writings were written, weren't they? Elpis Israel, Eureka, others. And we look at those today, and I'm sure many people would agree, they're complex pieces to read. They're difficult. They're a struggle to read sometimes. You really have to put intellectual ethic into it. And I did hear it suggested at one time by a speaker many years ago that when the pioneers wrote, they wrote at a higher intellectual level than what they would speak about in normal day-to-day life. The research on the Douglas and Lincoln debates would say that's not the case, that the people spoke as they wrote and they wrote as they spoke. That was the intellectual ethic of the time. It was normal. Now, if we are, as a community, needing to try and get these things into our hearts and our minds, and the King James Bible, just the concepts of Scripture, they're not simple things to do. We need the brain power, the intellectual capability to be able to do that. And for that, we really, really, really need that deep thinking part of our brain function. So anything that we're doing which is strengthening the power browsing at the expense of that thinking, that deep thinking, is something which is going to make life fairly difficult for us as we try to connect with and understand God. I don't want to try and minimise in this either the issues of content. Content has its own issues. What I'm talking about here very much is just the act of doing these things, whether it's good or bad, is going to have an impact on our brains, and we really, really need to think about that. Okay, I'm going to skip over most of that. I'm going to move on. The conscious mind. The author David Rock presents the idea of the mind as a stage. Stage that's your working memory. Actors coming on, actors coming off. And before anyone thinks that their stage is the size of the Festival Theatre or could easily fit the cast of Les Mis on it, I'm sorry, but that's probably more like our stage of our mind. It's quite small. It can generally hold in working memory somewhere between 4 to 7 different things, and then it starts to shuffle things off to move new things on. If you're a genius in a particular area, an expert in a particular area, maybe you can do 9 to 12, but only in that area. As soon as you move back into general space, you're back with the rest of us in the 4 to 7 mark. There's not a lot of space in our working memories to have lots of things coming in there. So you imagine your mind as that stage with the cacophony of noise and stimulus that's coming at you. there's lots of things being shuffled in and out of that memory. Now, the other thing that David Rock says is, imagine that the audience is where all your different memories are sitting, and the further back in the seats, they're the memories that you've used least. The ones closest to you are the ones that you're using most often. Remember what I said before about that gap between a stimulus and a response? Well, that really tells us, doesn't it, that what we want sitting in the front rows of our minds are the things that are going to help us make good decisions. And again, if we are bombarded with other stuff, then we're pushing those things further and further back, and it takes more energy to pick them up from those back seats and bring them and put them on the stage. Certainly a lot more than 0.4 of a second. Multitasking. What is it? The mythical activity in which people believe they can perform 2 or more tasks simultaneously. I had this in a teleconference today. A bloke said, "I'm sorry people, I'm male, I can't do more than 2 things, or I can't do more than one thing at once." Sorry to say, ladies, you're in the same boat. None of us can multitask. Multitask is a myth for the human brain. Every single one of us can multi-switch. We can be doing multiple things at the same time. We can be having a conversation while listening to something else, but we're not focused on that task. We'll get snippets from here, we'll get snippets from there. None of us is capable of doing 2 things properly at the same time. The way it's described is that our mind is like a beam of light. Right? We're concentrating on that beam of light, we can see what's there, everything outside of us is blurry or blank. As soon as we shift our focus, what it was on before becomes blurry or blank and something else is in focus. It's the way our mind works. So it is worth us making sure that we keep that mind focused and we keep the things that we're doing at a minimum so that we can do them properly. There's a cognitive test that's, many people may have seen it, a bunch of people bouncing a basketball, some in black shirts, some in white shirts. Partway through, a gorilla walks through, and usually you're given an instruction to watch either the black or the white, count the number of times they bounce and pass the ball to each other. 80% of people don't see the gorilla walking right through the middle of them. And that's because they're focused very much on that one activity that they've been given. And the human brain is so focused, it won't see things outside of that. And that happens, that test is given, it happens similarly time and time and time again. Okay. Last week, after our talk, I mentioned, didn't I, at the beginning, that Brother Steve had contacted me while I was in Paris, asked me to do these talks. Well, he sent me an email during the week saying, "Hey, I heard that. I told him you better listen again tonight because I'm quoting him again." In 2003, in a exhort at Happy Valley, he made, I believe, this comment. He might dispute that. "The best defence against a bad impulse is a good habit." And that's a really important thing, I think, for us. It's certainly something, if I'm interviewing a candidate for baptism, did one last night, that's the advice that I give them as my last piece of advice before they go towards baptism. We've got to develop those good habits, because the bad impulses we know are there. The only thing that's going to help us is the good habits. And that's, we want to think about that, that's conscience, isn't it? We have to train it. It has to be well fed. It has to be focused. But how do we go about training for conscience? There's no course that we can do that says that you'll come out of it with a certificate 4 in conscience or anything like that. But it's something that's really important to us, and maybe it's something we need to think about as a community. Is how do we help both within the ecclesia, and how do we support families to help develop good consciences in kids? Sometimes it just happens, but most of the time it takes work. Developing those habits might be something which helps analytical thinking, critical thinking, something that helps to get good control, good top-down control of the mind. The habits that are going to be formed over time, they need to be exercised, and so we need to do that. The good news is that if they do that and they connect, the dopamine hit comes in, they want to exercise that again, and that's how those habits are formed. Really quickly, I want to have a look at meditation, because I think when we look at Scripture focuses in on this, doesn't it? It says there's value in meditation. There's power in that quiet time. And the picture on the screen is of Isaac. And we read that, let's come across to Genesis. Genesis 24 and verse 63. We read there, "And Isaac went out to meditate in the field at eventide, and he lifted up his eyes and saw, and behold, the camels were coming." And the sense that I get from this, and I can't necessarily prove it, is that this was something that Isaac did on a regular basis. This wasn't just he'd received a messenger, "Hey, Rebecca's almost here," and he was out there just checking to see whether or not she was coming. This thing that he did, this meditation that he did, was something that he did on a regular basis. The Hebrew word that's used here, it's the only place that's used in Scripture, is the Hebrew word suach. And the ark part of that uses the same Hebrew letters as the Hebrew word ruach. Now, I haven't locked down a definite connection between those two. I'm not going to be dogmatic about this, but if there is a link between them, then you've got ruach, the breath of God, which is expired, which goes out, and you've got suach, meditation, bringing that in, ruminating on that, thinking about it. And that's what that word suach means, to ruminate on something, to turn it over in the mind. And hopefully I'm right, and that was something which Isaac did on a regular basis. That was his thing. He went out into the field, away from the distraction, so that he could think on things. And again, supposition, that they found in oral cultures, which is what the patriarchal times and even the times of Israel would have been. They weren't print culture, they weren't digital culture, they were oral culture, is that in their surroundings were embedded stories. So they'd go out there and they'd see something and they'd say, that reminds me of a particular story. That was the way that they encoded and passed on wisdom. The main point, though, he was away from the camp, wasn't he? He was out in the field. He was free of distraction, or freer of distraction. So meditation in the Bible, there's lots of things that we could look at. I've found in the Gospels probably about 14 to 16 times that Jesus was out by himself, either praying or meditating or doing something. And always, I think almost always, he was away from everyone else. He wasn't distracted by things. And so that gives us the idea, doesn't it, about what it is that we should, or what's going to help us. Now, I want to come back to Romans 2, and again, our minds will jump very clearly to these words in many cases. Yes, Romans 2, verse 1 and 2. We look at these verses, and more often than not, the comment that will come out of them is this idea of metamorphosis, this transformation which needs to take place. But what I want to focus in just for a few brief minutes is not actually the transformation bit, but the next step from that is how. How does that transformation take place? And it says there, doesn't it, by the renewing of the mind. And that renewing means to refurbish. So if you had an old car and you were going to refurbish the car, you take it right back to base and then you build it up, don't you? You make it new. That's what refurbishing is all about. And that's the idea behind that. So the way that we transform ourselves is by undertaking renewal. And that's, as I said, something that I think is really positive for us in all of this, is that our brain is so powerful and is such that it can be refurbished. It doesn't matter about the age. Neuroplasticity goes from birth right into old age. We can change our brains. Not saying that we can change it by ourselves, but the things that we do can change our brains if we're focusing and we're doing the right things. So by aiming for renewal, we're aiming to refurbish our minds, and so that's the function then of meditation, isn't it? Get rid of the distraction. We can think on the things of God. We can ruminate on them. We can make the connections. The dopamine hit that comes from making those connections makes us want to do it again, and so it can go on and on. And we strengthen that part of our minds. We're renewing our minds. And one of the things that I do find interesting is that when you sometimes read secular writers, they say things that think, well, we should know this. This is a blogger who was in the early days of the internet, and he was absolutely immersed in this. He had all these things happening. He loved it. Every time he got a like or a comment, it was, wow, this is fantastic. He was one of the early people that actually made money out of the internet. He thought it was wonderful, but got to the point that he was just completely overloaded. And he says this, and he's talking obviously about churches, but I think we can take a lesson from this. If the churches came to understand the greatest threat to faith today is not hedonism, but distraction, perhaps they might begin to appeal anew to a frazzled digital generation. Christian leaders seem to think that they need more distraction to counter the distraction. Their services have degenerated into emotional spasms, their spaces drowned with light and noise and locked shut through the day, when their darkness and silence might actually draw those whose minds and souls have grown web weary. Understanding that there needs to be that quietness. And I didn't put the quote up, but he also talks about and picks up on the the Judaistic tradition of the Sabbath. It says that was understood. There had to be a time where the noise and the run of the mill, the noise that was happening during the day had to stop. It was an imposed silence, if you like, an imposed time free of distraction that could be used to focus on life and had its connection with things that are eternal. And he even points out that for decades that was a natural part of Western life, that was always there. And then it just disappeared. In the last 2 decades, it's just become another day for other things. And that's perhaps something that we should try and think about. Adding entertainment, distraction, razzle-dazzle is not something that's necessarily going to help us. What we need is a time that we can really get into the things of the Word, that we can make sure that that deep thinking part of our mind is being well exercised. Getting to the end, this comic obviously has an environmental flavour to it. It's talking about the waste that humans dump out in the world, or what if it was reversed and the animals were dumping it into our houses. Substitute that for the stimulus that comes through the online world. It's out there, and yet so easily we let that come into our private places, our homes, the place that we can be safe and we can have that quietness in there. We need to find a way to turn off that tap and to try and keep things in their place and make sure that we've got that time that we can use to keep our minds focused on the things of God. Wilderness is absolutely vital, isn't it, to our objective. It's the thing that shaped Israel. It was used to shape Israel as a nation. God didn't try to shape Israel in the middle of Egypt. He took them into the desert, nothing else around them, and there he shaped them into a nation. John the Baptist didn't find his voice in the middle of Jerusalem. He found it in the desert, and then he was able to speak. And so we need to be doing the best that we can, and we've all got busy lives, and it's really difficult to do this. I'm not saying I know what the answer is and that we can flick a switch and these things can happen, but I do think that it's really important that we try to focus in on the things that are going to help us to connect with God. We need to do that as individuals for ourselves. We need to do it as parents for our families, and ecclesial leaders, I think we need to do that for our ecclesial families and the wider brotherhood as well. There's undoubtedly more questions and answers that might come from this, but there's things that I think if we think about them, we could perhaps put in place that can help us. Let's come across to finish off in Acts 24. I'm very sorry for going so far over time. Acts 24. And at verse 16. And herein do I exercise myself to have always conscience void of offence toward God and toward men. And that hope in the previous verses was the hope of the resurrection. And the word exercise there, as Strong says, is figuratively to train. So herein do I train myself to have always a conscience or a moral consciousness void of offence towards God and toward men. And surely that summarises, doesn't it, what we're trying to do with our lives. That's our target. Technology is here to stay. There's nothing that's going to change that, and it's probably going to change if Christ doesn't return even faster than what it is now. New things are going to be coming at us at 1,000 miles an hour. So it remains a serious challenge. It will become more invasive if it's not unchecked. But as we saw in the couple of quotes towards the end of last week, just remember that technology is not part of God's plan. It is the product of human creativity and hubris. It hasn't come from God. And so it does us all well to be really aware of it, to be conscious of it, to think about it. Not what it just does for us, but what it does to us. Thank you.